if you are here, I am sure you like my talks. I have a small request to make to you. Uh, Please make a small contribution to a charity or any organization you like. If you inform me that you have done so, I shall be delighted. Even if you don't inform me, it's fine. Okay. So with this introduction, let me start my lecture on the Mimamsa philosophy. Let me summarize what I have said so far. The Vedas and the Upanishads laid the foundation for the Indian philosophy. The Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya and Vaiseshika systems took them far ahead. None of these systems really needed a god, though a few of them had God foisted on them. Sankhya and Yoga spoke primarily about Purusha and Prakriti and their interactions. Nyaya and Vaisheshika, on the other hand, were concerned about logic. And Vaisheshika, in fact, spoke about the world being made of atoms. Lokayata, the completely materialist system, believed only in what it saw, which is Pratyaksha Pramana. It denied the existence of God or afterlife. It did not believe in heaven or hell. There were a few things common about the Indian systems. They all believed, barring Lokayata of course, in karma and rebirth. They thought the ultimate goal was to get a release from this seemingly endless cycle, in fact. Secondly, they all believed in the existence of Panchabhuta, that is, with a few additions in some cases. Thirdly, they all believed in some pramanas, which means valid means of knowledge. Some accepted, like the Lokayata, only one pramana, that is Pratyaksha Pramana. Some accepted several pramanas, including what had been said by Vedas and Upanishads and personalities like Buddha. With this introduction, let us plunge into the Mimamsa school of philosophy. The Mimamsa Sutra, the source book of this system, is a compilation of more than, I think, 2,500 sutras, supposed to have been written by Jaimini. As usual, its period is somewhat uncertain, but definitely it should be before the beginning of the Common Era. Jaimini himself quoted a large number of his forerunners and the discussions that took place regarding Vedic rituals, which incidentally is the prime concern of the Mimamsa philosophy. The earliest commentary now available on Mimamsa Sutra is Sabarabhashya, written sometime in the 4th century CE. The greatest Mimamsakas after Savara were Prabhakara and Kumarila Bhatta. Both commented on Sabara. The difference between Kumarila and Prabhakara is fundamental, and therefore there are two distinct schools of Mimamsa, the Bhatta school and the Prabhakara school. In many respects, Mimamsa agrees with Nyaya Vaiseshika school. It agrees that souls are plural and there's a huge number of them. It agrees that the world is real and all that exists in the world are real. But on two important aspects, it differs from the Nyaya Vaiseshika school. It does not agree with the atomic theory of Nyaya Vaiseshika school. It rejects the inference of the atom. It says the motes, the particles we see in the rays of sun are enough for them. They don't want to go further down. Mimamsakas say we cannot employ logic to defeat common sense. The other aspect is in relation to the Vedas. Nyaya holds that knowledge derived through the Veda is by itself is neither valid nor invalid. It is valid only because it proceeds from God. Mimamsa, on the other hand, does not recognize God, and for it, Vedas are valid because validity is inherent in it. This is very, very important. Validity is inherent in it. Vedas are not the creation of any person, human or divine, and they are self-existent. We must now probe further as to why Mimamsakas took this stand. The Vedic culture, which sired these philosophical schools, had a central theme, which was the practice of rituals. We should not lose sight of this important fact. From the Ashwamedha Yaga performed by the kings to the humble Sandhya Vandana, which is being performed by the Brahmins, Orthodox Brahmin even today, rituals were for the kings and householders to please the gods. Okay, they were the way. They were the way for the kings and the householders to please the gods. So it was inevitable that the validity of ritual and the authority of the Vedic texts on which rituals were based would be a central point of dispute between the Vedic tradition and its critics. For the Buddhists, rituals were nothing special. They were just another set of actions undertaken in pursuit of desires that would be better off without. They didn't want anyone to have desires. So adherence to the Veda, though called the authoritative text Shruti, meaning what is heard, and considered them a source of knowledge about the duties laid upon humanity. The philosophical schools often allude to the challenges posed by Buddhists and others. In fact, in the Nyaya Sutra, in fact, it says this is the opponent's view. The Purva Paksha, the enemy critique of the ritual, is summarized as follows. Nyaya Sutra says that the Vedas cannot command assent because they suffer from the following defects. What are those defects? Falsity, inconsistency, and repetition. The first charge of falsity derives from the fact that the promises of Vedic rituals are not always fulfilled. For instance, a rich householder seeking additional wealth might spend huge money on performing rituals, which might make him a pauper instead of a rich man. Or one may perform a different ritual aiming at getting a son, yet remain childless. Okay, there are certain rituals for attaining heaven. In fact, one of the Upanishads injunction says, one who desires heaven should perform the Agnihotra ritual. But Vatsayana, a commentator, had to admit that the shift of focus from material to spiritual goods might not be enough. That is, even if you perform rituals for getting into heaven, it may not give you heaven at all. That's what he says. A skeptic could still reply that if any of the ritual injunctions in the Vedas are false, then that brings the entire Vedic authority as a whole into disrepute. If you cannot rely on the rituals to get kids or gold, how do you think that they will get you into the heaven? This is the question the skeptics will ask. The other two objections are also quite heavy and damning. The Vedas are inconsistent and repetitive. The Vedas tell, for example, the Vedas tell us that after sunrise, perform the sacrifice, that is the yajna, after some time perform it. The Vedas also tell us that the sacrifice performed after sunrise goes to the dogs. Then there are cases of the same thing is said again and again. Something the critics compares to the rambling of a drunkard. That is Pramattavakya. The Pramattavakya, that's what they say. Okay, the rambling of a drunkard. The Nyaya Sutra Valas, they respond like this. They say rituals may fail sometimes, but that is always because of the faulty execution by the person performing the ritual. There is no defect in the rules governing the ritual. Okay, as far as the inconsistent rules, they say that they simply apply to different situations. That is, the sacrifice after sunrise goes to the dogs only if you had resolved to perform the sacrifice before sunrise. As for repetition, it says it is sometimes useful as it makes you remember what you have to do. But even the staunchest defender of the Vedas would have to admit that these are problematic texts. In addition to these three defects raised and then diffused by the Nyaya Sutra, rituals are often described in insufficient detail. So some kind of rational method was needed to systematize the Vedic injunctions and to understand how we should proceed in the face of incomplete information. This was the ambition of the Mimamsa, whose mission was to expound and interpret the Veda in the hopes of establishing consistent ritual conduct. You might ask, where does philosophy come in here? This is a question people might ask. See, this is in fact of philosophical interest because the ideas can be generalized from the ritual context so as to offer a general theory of practical action. Let us see how they do this. In fact, the Mimamsakas, in fact, they deal with gaps in the Vedas by reasoning from one case to other analogous cases. If a ritual is described with insufficient precision, this can be remedied through the procedure they call transfer, that is adhisesha, adaptation, uha, and then annulment, bhada. To complete the instructions from one ritual, one might look to another similar ritual which serves as a model. Okay, the details of the model are borrowed from the ritual we need to carry out. It's very, very simple. The words are very difficult. Now it's very simple. What it says is, let us say you are replacing the battery in your new cell phone for the first time. Let's say you bought a cell phone, its battery is out, you are replacing the battery. You know what to do because you have replaced batteries in other cell phones and can adapt the procedure to the different design of the new one. The logicians, in fact, call this rule of Vedic interpretation as the rise in the pot reasoning. Since it's like when you're cooking rice and taste just one grain to see if all others are cooked. தமிழில் ஒரு பானை சோத்துக்கு ஒரு சோறு பதம் சொல்கிறாங்க இல்லையா, அதுதான் இது. In that case, you unthinkingly transfer a property from one thing, that is the grain you have tasted, to others, the rest of the rice which you have not tasted. Okay, the Mimamsaka apply this rice in the pot reasoning to dharma. In fact, Mimamsaka says dharma depends on the Veda, so whatever is not Veda is not to be trusted. What it says is only the rice cooked in this pot has to be trusted. This is what the Mimamsaka try to say. But how can this be, given that the Veda is at best an incomplete guide to our ritual and moral duties? The Mimamsaka's answer, well, it may be incomplete, but it is the only guide we have. Most of our knowledge comes directly or indirectly from sense experience. But our senses tell us nothing about morality or rituals. Here, the Veda is our only source of knowledge. This is the fundamental conviction of the Mimamsa. To this fundamental conviction of Mimamsa, another thing is added, namely that the world has been as we see it now. More importantly, the Vedas have always been there and have always governed ritual practices. We can therefore feel really confident that the rituals as handed down to us have a basis in the Veda, even if the basis is obscure to us. And this is what the Mimamsaka philosophy says. Rituals, of course, are very special actions, but they are actions nevertheless. So to understand them, we need to explore the mechanisms of action more generally, in a general fashion. See, whatever we are doing, you are at least implicitly following a kind of rule or injunction. Do this. Injunction means do this or don't do this. Okay, that's injunction, okay? Which applies to you because of some desire you have. Okay. Let us say I am in the mood for a nice bowl of curd rice. I have a bowl of curd with me, but rice is not ready. My wife is away, let us say. Having conceived this desire, I apply the rule. If I want to have rice, I should cook the rice in boiling water. In general, the causal situation, there is bhavana, involves an agent which has a desire, and the objects and the advantage that is desired, the instrument by which it is achieved, and the procedure, of course. In our example, let us say, for cooking the rice, the agent would be me, that is, I want the rice. The object would be the rice I want to eat, the curd rice I want to eat. The instrument would be cooking, and the procedure would be the whole sequence of steps to be followed. That is, turning on the gas, getting water from the tap, boiling it, and so on. This may all seem quite straightforward, but please consider, please imagine, what does the Bhagavad Gita say? Nishkama karma. You do something without desire. So philosophically, this is problematic. That is, you should have desire for an action. The claim is that any action presupposes the presence of desire in the one who performs the action. This is the Mimamsaka's stand. This doesn't gel with what is said in the Bhagavad Gita. Instead of giving up all desire or detaching yourself from the outcome of what you do, you should act by following the rules that apply to you in virtue of your desires. It may seem surprising that participation in Vedic ritual is so contingent on the performer's goal. Don't we all have standing obligation to perform religious rites? This question you may ask. That is, does every human being have an obligation to perform the religious rites? The Mimamsaka says no. There's absolutely no obligation. That's what the Mimamsaka says. Okay. There's no pure duty to perform the Vedic rites without the desire, that is injection, that is sodhana, that's right, to perform a ritual simply does not apply. Okay. So the thing is, if you counter argue that some rituals in Veda specify no intended outcome at all, Mimamsa responds that in such cases, the default object of desire will be heaven. And heaven is happiness, and happiness is desired by all. In fact, in Mimamsaka, women are invited to participate in the rituals not because their husbands are doing, it's because they too have desires. Okay. Now, the other question is, this might give us the impression that rituals exist only for the benefit of us. That is, if you have a desire, you perform the ritual and your desire is fulfilled. That's what we think. It is, in other words, the rituals is being subordinated to human whims and projects. But surprisingly, in Mimamsaka philosophy says, just reverse is the case. For Mimamsa, what has ultimate and intrinsic value is the ritual itself. In fact, the ritual uses the human agent rather than the other way around. The person performing the ritual and his desire provide the occasion for the ritual. Without human goals, no ritual would occur, that we know. But that does not mean that the ritual has no value beyond the fulfillment of those goals. Instead, the Mimamsaka says very clearly the rituals exist for its own sake. That is swartha, their own sake. In fact, it says if a person's performing the ritual dies in between, his bone could be collected within an antelope skin, and this posthumous puppet would be made to carry out the remaining steps of the ceremony by others, of course. Okay, this is what the Mimamsaka says. This is the basic stand of the Mimamsaka. The Mimamsaka viewpoint is, of course, diametrically opposite to the Buddhist viewpoint. In that, Mimamsaka viewpoint is totally committed to the value of rituals and the authority of the Veda, and also in its endorsement of human desire. Yet, as Anderson says, it also captures something of the spirit of Buddhism and may be responding to Buddhist challenge by incorporating some of his ideas. We have a subtle shifts from the concrete goal like money and family towards Swarga, that is heaven, as a universal aim. We do not have the elimination of desire, obviously, but we do see a downgrading of the individual's desire as a mere contributing factor in the ritual. And most strikingly, the Mimamsa philosophy completely eliminates the supernatural element. The Mimamsaka Sutra doesn't tell us to perform the Vedic rituals to please the gods or to perform rituals out of absolute religious obligation. Instead, rituals are understood as being similar to humdrum everyday actions. If you want to get such and such a goal, then you have to follow the prescribed procedure. Let us say the goal in question is sambar sadam for me, then I will consult my mother or grandmother or a cookbook. Here, if the goal is to do with the dharma, your dharma, you will have to consult the Veda. Okay. Indeed, though sometimes scholars say that Veda is revealed or revelatory, the Mimamsakas are adamant that it was not revealed by anyone in particular. The Vedas have no author, and the rishis who expounded it were not like the, say, the prophet of the Old Testament. They simply transmitted the authoritative Veda which existed before them. In fact, it has always existed. Again, here we see the human agency is being sidelined to some extent and subordinated to the intrinsic value of the Veda, just as human agency is subordinated to the rituals. The forefathers who passed on wisdom and also reliable practices to us may have been very admirable and very trustworthy, but they did not invent or compose the Vedas. The most a human can do is to serve as a conduit from the past to the future. A human being is never a conduit between the divine and the rest of humanity. Okay, like Prophet Muhammad. Yeah, because there is no such conduit needed. The Veda has been here, has always been here. It has been an eternal source of knowledge set down by neither God nor man or woman. If Veda is permanent and has no author, then it cannot contain any errors. After all, errors only arise when there is someone like an author who is in a position to make a mistake. If the Vedas have no author, it must be entirely trustworthy. This is the line of argument of the Mimamsakas. But there is more to the teaching than that. The Mimamsakas ground their account of the Veda in a naturalist account of human knowledge. Roughly speaking, the reasons for acknowledging the truth of Veda are the same as your reasons now for acknowledging that you are watching, this Facebook session right now, or that you are in front of a cup of tea and sipping that tea. They say it is as real as that. If you believe in this, if you believe in your daily routine or daily what you are doing, you should believe in this. That's what the Mimamsakas say. How then can they stop the skeptic from arguing from the misleading nature of one sense experience to the doubtfulness of sensation as a whole? That is, some sense experience, they become false. Okay, the rope and snake example, I will come to it later in detail. But, okay, so why can't we, the entire sensation may be, why can't we doubt this? The Mimamsakas argument is that you should take every cognition to be true. That is, every experience to be true unless it is trumped or denied by another experience that overturns it. The commentators, of course, including Sabara, they do admit that a variety of factors can undermine sensation in this way. For instance, you may taste the stuff in the pan and realize that it is too sweet to be rice, or it is too bitter to be rice, or might be you were drunk at that time, so which would undermine your sensations and belief more generally. Okay, what does this mean? Yep. In fact, some of the guys, some of the Mimamsakas, they have different views. Kumarila Bhatta says that a sensation is valid so long as it arouses in a reliable way. So long as you are not in fact deranged, that is mad or drunk and so on, your cognitions are reliable. It is up to us, up to each of us to check whether our cognitions arose in a trustworthy fashion. If so, we may and indeed place our trust on them. Others thought that Kumarila's point was the valid sensation actually present themselves to us as true. If you see rice in a bowl in front of you in a normal condition, you have no hesitation in taking yourself to know there is rice in front of you. Only if there is a warning sign like staying straight to the rice or an awareness that you are drunk would you even consider doubting the perception you are having. As Kumarila Bhatta puts it, that cognition which is unshaken and does not conflict with cognitions occurring at other times and places is a pramana. That is, what you see, what you cognize is a proof, is an authority, is a valid source of knowledge. This is what Kumarila Bhatta says. You may ask, doesn't this amount to an unjustified leap of faith? Can Kumarila Bhatta insist dogmatically that we can trust our perceptions? Okay. This is what the skeptics question. Okay. And they have a good reason for this. Namely, perceptions are at least occasionally misleading. Now, let us see how the Mimamsakas counter this. Okay. They borrow a weapon from the skeptics' own arsenal. They say, Mimamsakas says very, very simply, they say, if we demand some sort of confirmation or justification for every one of our cognitions, then consider this. Each cognition will need another cognition that confirms it. For instance, if you say that salt is salty, okay, if you say that, if someone says, how do you say that? The other person says this. The next person says this. The next person says this. Okay. This is how you proceed, That's why we assume that the salt's taste is salty. If I double check is by tasting it, how do you know that I am tasting it accurately? So you will ask another person, okay, to taste it. But your agreement that salt is always salty is also open to skeptical challenge. So the moral we draw from this is that, as we know, if you take it ad infinitum, till the end, no pramana can be made reliable. Okay. So you can question this, you can question the other one, you can question the other one, it will go on and on and on and on. The Mimamsaka, in fact, they use this to draw a reverse conclusion. What they say is, there must be some fundamental cognitions, since otherwise we could never be confident of knowing anything at all. Okay. But it is clear that we are confident of having knowledge. That's what they say. You say that yours is your skepticism, you say Buddhist, you say yours is the right knowledge, you are confident of something. I am confident of this. So you agree with some foundational cognitions. Otherwise we cannot, we can never be confident of anything. This is how the Mimamsaka argues. Where Buddhism denies the existence of an enduring soul, the self, Mimamsakas, they insist upon it. We recognize automatically that there's an I who has experienced the things we remember experiencing and feel that this is who we still are. Just as I see that there's a dirty cup or a handkerchief sitting in front of me, I remember myself drinking the tea and wiping my mouth with this handkerchief about an hour ago. Okay. So the Mimamsakas, what they say is the denial of I, that is making short shift of the nuanced critique by the Buddhists. Mimamsaka thinkers simply assume that you are right in taking ourselves to be enduring objects of experience, since there is nothing to defeat that expression. Nothing could overturn the impression that one has a self. The most far-reaching and celebrated aspect of Mimamsaka's view on the permanent authority of the Veda is their inference that language itself must be permanent. That is, language itself was ever existing. Okay. So far, Mimamsaka says that very, very clearly that whatever ordinary experience, everyday experiences are real. There's nothing doubtful about them. Okay. With this plan, they move on to the other one. That is, they say the language is permanent. The Mimamsaka scholars offer a whole range of arguments to support this, surprising claim. For one thing, they say children learn language by watching adults use language. We have no evidence that things have been otherwise. So, basing ourselves as always on our experience of the world, we may assume that the language has always been passed down from generation to generation. Okay. So there should also be a first generation. The Mimamsaka says the generations they go on. No. So furthermore, there is good reason to think that things cannot be otherwise. Take a word like cow, or in Sanskrit go. Okay. Go Mata, we say na. It refers to cows universally, Mimamsakas say, and not to any particular cow. So when I say it on numerous occasions, I am using the one and the same word over and over, and not a new word each time. That is, this is universal word. That's what they say. You may say that there could be another possibility, namely that each word was introduced at some point and therefore they came to be used with a stable meaning thanks to the convention and agreement among the users of the relevant language. That's what we normally say. Okay. Against this, Mimamsaka argues that even if one can learn the meaning of individual new words, there is no way to introduce a new language as such. It is impossible to learn and speak or understand speech without engaging in and observing linguistic activity. Children who are learning to discover the meaning of each word by seeing how the elders talk. Once we are competent language users, we can learn new words by hearing them explained with other words. The Mimamsaka says it is inconceivable that this process could ever have begun from a situation where there is no language at all. Okay, so they say languages have ever been they are in existence. At least Sanskrit, they say it has always been in existence. That's what they say. So as a critic, you may point out that if I say to the person, let us say assisting me in a ritual, bring the cow, then I am referring to some specific cow or not cows in general. How can this be if the word cow is universal in its reference? This is a question you might ask. The answer given by the Mimamsakas is that a word on its own cannot refer to anything in particular. Okay. For this, you need a context, which at least includes the context provided by the rest of the sentences, and typically also other sentences and the circumstances in which they are spoken. By putting the words bring the cow, bring the in front of the cow, as I am narrating a pose, I can get my assistant to understand that you should bring the particular cow that is about to be tied to the post. Okay. The Mimamsaka, they take this further on, even if you were satisfied with this answer, they are not satisfied. What they say is, there is this logic, it entered into a dispute between two schools of Mimamsakas. This was famous split between Kumarila Bhatta and Prabhakara. Kumarila accepts that words have a general meaning when standing by themselves. That is, Kumarila Bhatta says, the simple utterance of cow, it does signify something. But that meaning is affected by putting the words into a complete sentence and connecting them so as to produce a new and a composite meaning. Okay, it's very clear. When you say cow, we don't know what it is doing, It may be a dead cow, or it may be a brain, it may be a moving cow. Okay, it may be a walking cow. Okay, it may be a sick cow. We don't know the cow. So the meaning depends on when the context is added by putting it into a complete sentence. Okay. This Kumarila call is Abhihitanvayavada. This is what Kumarila Bhatta, Abhihitanvayavada. This is what Kumarila Bhatta called. That is the theory of the connection of what has been expressed. By contrast, Prabhakara teaches that words must appear within a sentence in order to have any meaning at all. That is, without a complete sentence, words do not have any meaning. This is what Prabhakara says. This view is called, the theory of expression through what has been connected. That is, Anvitabhidhanavada is called. And it may be, this doesn't sound plausible when you look at first. Surely, if you just say the word cow, it does call some meaning to mind for you. But Prabhakara's views has been made in a context. You should not dismiss it so easily. Okay, certainly many words do seem to lack fixed meaning apart from the context. In fact, in English is beautifully explained by the Anderson's book, the classical philosophy book, from which I have taken most of these, these arguments and counter arguments. It says, it takes up one word. Consider a word like at, and its different meanings in the phrases. Let us say, the cow is at the sacrificial post. The at is here. We will sacrifice her at sunrise. Okay, here that is there. The cow looked at me with her big brown eyes. That is here. All at once, I decided I could not go through with the sacrifice. Here that is there. Okay, so the act has different meaning depending on the context. What Prabhakara says is that if you it makes sense given the overall aim of Mimamsa, which is an inquiry into ritual injunctions. That is, if you say something in ritual, so there's a place for it. A mantra If a word in a mantra, it has a place for it. If you shift it, its value is lost. Okay. So Prabhakara takes a stand that every word has a meaning only within the context of a sentence. This is what Prabhakara says. Okay. So there's another issue in which where Prabhakara and Kumarila Bhatta differs. We all know about the famous snake rope illusion. One mistaking a rope for a snake. To counter the theory of such illusions, Prabhakara developed a theory known as Akhyadi, that is non-apprehension. He says that in the case of snake rope illusion, what took place was two imperfect pieces of knowledge. The perception of the rope was an imperfect perception. It was perceived without considering the distinct features of a rope. As regards a snake, it was perceived without considering the previous recollection of a snake, again not in the form of a full-fledged recollection, but perceived instantly. Okay. The error, according to Prabhakara, consisted simply in the failure to have the apprehension of the proper distinction between two separate pieces of imperfect cognition. This Prabhakara says non-apprehension rather than any real apprehension. Mistaking one for the other is not apprehending either. That is, mistaking one for the other is not apprehending either. So this should be called non-apprehension. Nonetheless, he agrees that there exists a real rope, so there exists a real snake. What has been apprehended is not empty, nothing. Okay, but it is non-apprehension, that's what he says. The Bhatta school, that is Kumarila Bhatta school, did not approve of this Akhyadi theory. Okay, it was more in tune with the Nyaya Vaisheshikas. That theory is called, Anyata Khyadi is called. Okay, instead of Khyadi is Anyata Khyadi is called. It is mistaking one thing for the other. A case of misapprehension instead of non-apprehension. Thus, in spite of an illusion being a single experience, there would be two distinct objects to it, snake and the rope. The rope was not perceived as a full-fledged rope, but as a snake. When the illusory perception was corrected by the correct knowledge, this is rope and not a snake, what was really negated was only part of the previous experience, which was concerned with the snake, while the other part of the experience, that of experiencing of the rope, remained unaffected. That that is always there. A rope will be a rope in darkness and in bright sunlight. What Kumarila says is illusory perception is partially a valid perception of something that is objectively real, one which exists in this world. A snake, though wrongly perceived, was nevertheless real, existing at a different place at a different time. A illusory perception of a snake will not make a snake itself illusory. Therefore, illusion was apprehension of one real thing into another real thing, a case of misapprehension. This is the difference between the Kumarila Bhatta school and the Prabhakara school. The Mimamsaka, in fact, they are sure that the words used by the Vedas are being employed in their normal sense. That is, if the Vedas say, the Vedas commands you to tie a cow to a post, it is not using the words cow or post in an allegorical or a extended or a unfamiliar or a philosophical sense. Mimamsaka says it's simply calling a cow, and a post. Still, it is a unique source of knowledge on one that could only have been delivered in the form of language. Okay, we said we need language to describe and articulate goals that are not at present and to explain how these goals are to be achieved. Okay, this is typical of Mimamsa, a theory devoted to interpreting the Vedas by offering an epistemology grounded in sense experience and an analysis of the Veda that can apply just as well to sentences uttered by anyone with the knowledge of the language. Here it is Sanskrit. As I said earlier, the Mimamsa makes no appeal to, I am repeating because it has to go into it, go into your mind, and that's why I am repeating it. The Mimamsa makes no appeal to supernatural forms of knowledge and in fact impatiently rejects such claims when they were made by other schools. The claim that Buddha was, omniscient is brusquely dismissed, as is the notion that yoga can confer a special form of insight on its practitioners. Such supposed forms of cognitions simply have no basis in our real normal experience. And it is normal experience we should follow along with the testimony in the form of language, unless, of course, we have good reason not to do so. This is what the Mimamsaka says. They say, trust in Vedas. The words in Vedas, they have no other meaning. No, you will have to do the ritual, you will get the benefit. Okay. Their meaning is the ordinary meaning. No, that's what they say. And everything is real. There's nothing special about any of these things. Yogic experience is not special. Okay. That's what the Mimamsaka keep on saying. Another striking feature of Mimamsa is the absence of God in the system. In fact, Radhakrishnan says that this lacuna of Purva Mimamsa was so unsatisfactory that later writers slowly smuggle God. Okay. In fact, some of the later guys says God had written the Vedas during the times of Pralaya. But both Kumarala Bhatta and Prabhakara elaborately argue why the concept of Pralaya or Srishti, the creation of the world, is at best a fiction. Sabara rather says bluntly that there is no evidence of God's existence because sense perception does not reveal God. And all sources of knowledge are based on sense perception. Okay. If you remember, I spoke about the Potter analogy, of the Nyaya philosopher, that God being the efficient cause, that without a potter there cannot be a pot. This logic, I spoke on it, last time. The Mimamsaka scholars demolish this logic in a grand manner. Okay, what they say is that the world is eternal does not mean that individual things do not have a beginning or an end. There's of course the constant process of becoming and passing away. As for the individual things of the world, we need not assume more than what we actually observe. Okay. For instance, if a child is born, the assumption is that two persons mated a few months ago. God hasn't created that child. Kumarala's argument, in fact, is rather ingenious. He says the whole argument of Nyaya rests on the potter causing the pot. There's a cause, it's the efficient cause. Now, Kumarala Bhatta says, now if potter is the real cause of the pot, God is not actually the cause. So it is useless to think that God causes everything in the world. If on the other hand, God is actually conceived to be the cause of everything, the potter cannot be the real cause of the pot. In other words, your Udarana is useless. So either you let either abandon the Udarana, the example, that is the part-parter example, or the conclusion that we have arrived based on the example. This is what Kumarila Bhatta says. Okay. Kumarila also says that a disembodied soul like God cannot create anything. To create, one has to have a body, and none can create one's own body, and hence another creator is needed, and it goes on forever ad infinitum. He makes many such arguments against God that need not detail us here. Especially, he makes such argument against the Vedantic position, which is going to be my next part of my